Now we're going to start by talking about the different tests for this unit. And we'll start by testing the difference between sample and population means. The best estimate for the population mean is going to be a sample mean. When we don't have access to the population mean, the sample mean is usually a pretty good estimate, and it becomes more so as we get more people in our sample. So with the sample mean, I can compute a confidence interval, and then I can use the standard deviation to estimate the standard error of the mean. And this is very helpful to us. But when I need to test a hypothesis, I need to compute what's called a t-ratio. A t-ratio is a statistic that compares the mean of the sample to the mean of the population. So if I were to draw this, okay, I would have the mean of the population here. Okay, this is the sampling distribution. And here's the mean of the population. And remember that underneath this curve are infinite potential samples, okay, of different sizes. And if I randomly pull one sample from underneath that distribution and I compute a t-ratio, it can tell me that I have that my observed sample mean is 1.2 standard errors away from my population mean, and that's very useful. And then I want to compare the values to the t-critical values. We discussed this earlier in the last lecture, in which I said that we're going to have significance values or areas of rejection, and those critical values are going to be associated with that decision that we get in table C. So I know, for example, that 1.2 in this case does not fall into my area of rejection. So I would then conclude that this mean that produced a t-ratio of 1.2 is not significantly different than the overall population. This value is well within our range of sampling error. And so when all I want to do is test whether or not a single mean value, okay, is or is not equal to the population mean, okay, then I can do what's called a single sample t-test for a mean difference. And I compute my t-ratio and then plot it on this axis and look for it to fall in my levels of significance or not. Now, sometimes I want to know whether or not there's a difference between two independent samples means, in which case I have a situation like this. I have group 1, which produces a mean for group 1, and I want to test the hypothesis that that sample is equal to the second sample. So say, for example, I have software business, and I'm comparing it to production. Okay? And I want to know whether or not there are differences in employee morale across those two industries. An independent samples t-test would allow me to draw a population of software employees and a population of production employees and compare their means for statistical significance. And so this can occur between different types of training, in which case I might want to ask, does training 1, okay, here, does training 1 result in different outcomes than training 2? Okay, I might want to know whether or not training affects performance, in which case I can have one group participating in training and the other group not participating in training. But the key is that these groups are separate from each other. Okay? These represent different samples. And we're testing the hypothesis that the two samples actually come from different populations. And then another example is testing the difference between dependent sample means. So sometimes I want to know whether or not there's a change over time, in which case I want to know, does an employee reduce error rates as a result of undergoing a training, in which case I'd have that person's error rate before training. Okay, at pre-test, and then I'd have the error rate after training at post-test. And the idea is then I could do a pre-post comparison with the use of a dependent sample test. And sometimes I also want to know if paired observations are different. Let's say, for example, that I'm testing twins' intelligence level. I might want to know whether or not twin one's outcome, let's just call it IQ for now. I want to know whether or not twin 1 IQ predicts or is related to twin 2 IQ. Okay? Because these observations are matched, okay, there is a dependency in the data. So the idea is that there's some sort of dependency in both of these cases. In this case, twin 1 shares genetic material with twin 2. Therefore, those observations are not statistically independent. In this case, I have an individual's pretest and post-test. Because this is the same person, there's also dependency there.